I came home to find giant pumps sucking the life out of my wife's memorial. The HOA was draining my mountain lake over a fake flood risk, and their new president stood there smirking, thinking she'd won. She thought she was just draining a pond, but she had no idea what she was really standing on. A secret that supplies the entire county's water. And she just gave me the reason to turn the valve. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, because you are not ready for this level of payback. And if you believe no homeowner should ever be terrorized by a power-hungry HOA, hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss the moment they find out who they really messed with. The new HOA president showed up at my door on a Tuesday morning, holding a clipboard like it was a scepter. Her name was Madeline Krantz. She'd been elected 3 months ago on a platform of restoring community standards, which seemed to mean harassing anyone with a garden gnome. She had that brittle smile of a middle manager who's just discovered a new rule she can enforce. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She just handed me a single sheet of paper from her clipboard. The heading was stark: Order for Nuisance Abatement. My eyes scanned the page. It said the unregistered body of water at the back of my property posed a significant flood risk to the downstream community and had to be drained within 14 days. I almost laughed. Body of water? She meant the lake, Eleanor's lake. I looked from the paper to her perfectly styled hair. Madeline, I said, keeping my voice level, this isn't a pond. It's a spring-fed reservoir. I engineered and built it myself 30 years ago. It's fully permitted, inspected annually, and has a spillway designed to handle a 1,000-year flood event. She just nodded, like I was a child, explaining a drawing. The board appreciates your perspective, Tom. However, a formal complaint was filed, and an expert assessment confirms the risk. It has to go. I asked to see this expert assessment. She pulled another sheet from her clipboard. It looked like something a high schooler made in shop class. It had no letterhead, no engineer's seal, and no signature. It just had a few vague sentences about potential soil saturation and unmitigated overflow potential. I recognized the template. It was a cheap form downloaded from a landscaping website. I pointed this out. This isn't an engineering report, I said. This is a flyer. Who wrote this? She pulled the paper back, her smile tightening. The assessment was conducted by a qualified third party. We are not at liberty to disclose vendor information due to privacy protocols. It was corporate gibberish, a word salad designed to shut down questions. I tried a different approach, the neighborly one. Look, I was the senior water systems engineer for the county for 40 years. I designed half the culverts in this development. I can walk you through the schematics, show you the inspection records, even the original soil reports. This lake is safer than the HOA's retention pond down by the clubhouse. For a moment, her mask slipped. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. She hated being told I knew something she didn't. That won't be necessary, she snapped, her voice crisp. The board's decision is final. 14 days, Tom. Or we will be forced to take action and bill you for the expense. She turned and marched back down my driveway, her sensible shoes clicking on the asphalt. I closed the door, the flimsy order still in my hand. It felt like a joke. The lake was the last piece of Eleanor I had left. We'd designed it together after I retired. She'd picked the spot where the wild dogwoods bloomed every spring. She'd chosen the flat river stones for the shore and the spot for the little wooden bench where she'd sit and read. After she was gone, I spread her ashes there, just like she'd asked. The idea of some power-hungry newcomer paving it over for community green space made my stomach clench. I picked up the phone and called my old friend Frank, who used to be the county planning director. He laughed when I told him the story. Tom, they can't do that. It's a pre-existing, permitted structure on private land. Your property deeds include watershed easements that predate that HOA by 20 years. They have zero jurisdiction over that lake. Zero. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Frank was right. This was just a bluff. A power play. Just get your permits and the original deed survey together, he said. Send them a certified letter with copies. They'll back down. They have no legal leg to stand on. I felt better after that. It was all a mistake, an overreach by a new president trying to prove she was tough. I spent the next 2 days in my office, gathering every piece of paper I had. The original county permits, stamped and signed. The geological surveys, decades of my own handwritten maintenance logs, annual inspection photos. I put it all into a neat, thick folder. On Thursday morning, I drove down to the county records office to get a certified copy of the original property plat, just to be thorough. The clerk was an older woman who remembered me from my county days, and we chatted for a bit while she pulled the files. I felt confident, even a little smug. I was going to bury Madeline Krantz in a mountain of lawful, professionally executed paperwork. I took the long way home, stopping for a coffee, imagining the look on her face when my lawyer served her with a cease and desist. But as I turned onto my street, I heard it. A low, throbbing hum that didn't belong. It was the sound of a large gasoline engine, working hard. I pulled into my driveway and my heart stopped. A big, unmarked panel truck was parked on the grass. 2 thick black hoses snaked from the back of it, across my lawn, and down toward the lake. I got out of my car and ran. There, standing by the shore, was Madeline. She had her clipboard, of course. Beside her, a young man in a branded polo shirt was watching as the pumps chugged away, spewing a torrent of my lake's water into the storm drain down the street. The water level was already down by at least 4 feet. The beautiful stone shoreline Eleanor had designed was now just a wide, ugly ring of dark, wet mud. A small handful of trout were flopping helplessly in the rapidly shrinking shallows. The family of ducks that lived here were circling in a panic. And Eleanor's bench, it sat high and dry, isolated on a barren patch of cracked earth, looking like a forgotten gravestone. Madeline saw me coming. She didn't look guilty. She looked triumphant. "You were non-compliant, Tom," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We had to take action." My paperwork felt heavy and useless in my hand. All my proof, all my facts, all my reason. It meant nothing to her. She hadn't waited the 14 days. She hadn't even waited for the weekend. The moment I was gone, she'd moved in. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the dying water, the exposed mud, the trashed memorial to my wife. I stared at the gushing hose pouring 30 years of my life into a ditch. I turned to look at her, my face calm, but something inside me had gone cold and hard as granite. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, the chugging of the pump filling the space between us. Then I looked past her, at the muddy ground where my wife's lake used to be, and I spoke, my voice low and steady. I told them not to wake the water. The local news van showed up the next day. A young reporter, looking earnest and out of his depth, stood on the sidewalk with the muddy, half-drained pit of my lake as his backdrop. I watched through my living room window as he reported on the neighborhood dispute over an unauthorized pond. Then they cut to Madeline, who had clearly prepared for this. She stood there looking concerned and professional, a little furrow in her brow. She explained that the HOA had acted on an urgent expert recommendation to mitigate a long-standing flood risk. She painted me as an uncooperative, sentimental old man, clinging to a dangerous pet project and refusing to listen to reason. She said she felt for my loss, but her primary duty was to the safety of the entire community. The performance was flawless. She was the hero. I was the problem. I called the county again, getting passed from one clueless clerk to another, leaving messages that were never returned. Frank, my old buddy, called me back sounding frustrated. "They're stonewalling, Tom," he said. "The current administration doesn't want to get into a public fight with an HOA. They see it as bad press. Politically, it's easier to just stay quiet and let you take the hit." I was on my own. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, slow-burning anger. an engineer's anger. I stopped looking at the muddy hole in my backyard as a wound. I started looking at it as a crime scene. That afternoon, my neighbor Sarah came over, carrying a plate of sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Sarah was a retired high school history teacher, sharp as a tack, and with a healthy distrust for anyone who used the word protocol. She'd lived next door for 40 years. She sat at my kitchen table, looked out the window at the devastation, and shook her head. "That woman," she said, her voice tight, "is a menace. What are you going to do?" I laid out the phony expert assessment on the table. "I'm going to start with this," I told her. This is where the lie began. For the next few hours, we turned my kitchen into a command center. Sarah was a wizard at navigating public records websites and digging through social media. I handled the technical side, cross-referencing business licenses and corporate filings. The landscaping company listed on the unsigned report was called Eco Conversion Solutions. It had only been registered 6 months ago. Its listed address was a P.O. box. But the corporate registration papers had a name on them: Derek Krantz. Sarah let out a low whistle. "Krantz," she said. "Same as Madeline. Let me guess." She clicked away on her tablet for a minute, and then turned the screen toward me. It was a photo from Madeline's Facebook page. There she was, arm around the smirking young man I'd seen by the pumps. The caption read, "So proud of my brilliant nephew Derek for launching his new business, the future of community landscaping." It was dirty, but it wasn't enough. It was her word against mine. Nepotism wasn't a crime, just sleazy. We needed the money trail. HOA finances are supposed to be transparent, Sarah mused. They have to present a budget at the quarterly meetings. The next meeting wasn't for 2 months. We couldn't wait that long. "I might have a way," Sarah said, a glint in her eye. She made a phone call to another longtime resident, a woman named Carol, who was on the HOA's finance committee and had been complaining for weeks that Madeline was shutting her out, signing checks without approval. An hour later, a plain manila envelope was in my mailbox. Inside were photocopies of the HOA's most recent bank statements and a document titled Special Project Expenditure, Lakeside Green Initiative. My hands shook slightly as I read it. It was a contract between the HOA and Eco Conversion Solutions. The scope of work was vague: Phase 1 site clearing and organic material removal. The price tag was $120,000. And right at the bottom, a detail that made the breath catch in my throat: payment in full upon signing. Madeline had paid her nephew the entire sum up front before a single shovel had hit the ground. On the final page, there was a single signature line for board approval, and only one signature was on it: Madeline Krantz. There was no board vote, no co-signer. She'd pushed it through herself. This wasn't about flood risk or community safety. It was a $120,000 heist, disguised as a neighborhood improvement project. My wife's lake wasn't a liability. It was the bank. I thanked Sarah, my mind racing. She could see the shift in my eyes. The grief was gone, replaced by something much harder. I walked her to the door. "Be careful, Tom," she said quietly. "This isn't just a busybody anymore. This is a thief." I nodded. "Thieves don't understand engineering, Sarah. They only understand leverage." After she left, I stood in my silent house for a long time. I had the motive. I had the fraud. But a lawsuit would take years. By then, the Lakeside Green Initiative would be a done deal. I needed a different kind of leverage, one that they couldn't ignore or bury in paperwork. I went to the garage and grabbed a heavy-duty T-wrench from my toolbox. Then I walked out the back door, past the muddy scar of the lakebed, to the far edge of my property line where the woods began. Half hidden under an overgrown azalea bush was a round, heavy, cast-iron circle set flush with the ground, a well cover. I knelt down, fitted the T-wrench into the 2 holes, and with a grunt, I broke the seal of rust and time and twisted. I lifted the heavy lid aside. Below set into a concrete housing, wasn't a well. It was a massive steel valve wheel, maybe 2 feet across. It was painted fire engine red, and even in the dim light, I could see the official county seal stamped right into the center of it. It had been 30 years. 30 years of silence, sitting right under their noses. I ran my hand over the cool, pitted metal. They'd stolen my water, drained it into a gutter, and now they were planning on cashing a check. A quiet, grim smile touched my lips as I looked down at the valve that held the entire system in balance. I muttered it to the empty air, to the ghosts of the trout and the memory of my wife. Guess they forgot where this water really comes from. That red valve wheel wasn't just hardware. It was a promise I made to the county almost 20 years ago. I remembered the meeting like it was yesterday. It was in the early 2000, right after a bad drought had nearly crippled the municipal water supply. The county's primary system was old, overworked, and had no reliable backup. Frank, the planning director at the time, was sweating bullets. They had a 10-year plan to build a new reservoir, but they had no fail-safe for the meantime. So, I drew up a plan on a single sheet of engineering paper. I told them I could build a secondary, gravity-fed intake from my spring-fed lake. It would be completely off-grid, running on nothing but elevation and pressure. In the event of a primary pump failure, a fire, or a contamination event, they could open one valve and keep water flowing to the hospital, the fire stations, and 3 downstream residential districts. It wouldn't supply the whole county, but it would prevent a catastrophe. I told them I'd fund the construction myself. My one condition was that it had to be kept off the public maps. We live in a world where one person with a grudge or a bad idea can cause a lot of damage. The fewer people who knew about the emergency intake, the safer it would be. Frank and the old county commissioners agreed. They saw it as a brilliant, quiet solution. So, my crew and I did the work. We laid the pipes, set the valve house, and tied it into the main grid a mile downstream. I never asked for a dime or a word of credit. It was just the right thing to do. A silent safeguard. And for 20 years, everybody drank my silence. Now, with the lake drained to a muddy puddle, that entire emergency system was nothing more than a series of empty pipes. The safeguard was gone. The promise was broken. And to make matters worse, the local news was talking about an unusually dry spring. The county was already asking residents to voluntarily conserve water. Water pressure in the older parts of town, the parts fed by the oldest mains, was already beginning to dip during peak hours. People were complaining online about weak showers and garden hoses that just dribbled. They didn't know it, but the system was already strained, running with no safety net. I called the new county water commissioner, a young man named Peterson, whose picture in the paper made him look like he was barely out of college. I explained who I was and what Madeline had done. I kept my voice professional, just an engineer reporting a critical systems failure. The emergency bypass originating from Blake Reservoir is now offline. I told him, the reservoir has been drained by a third party. I'm advising you that your emergency water supply is compromised. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Blake Reservoir? He said, like he'd never heard the name. Sir, I'm looking at the county maps, and all I see at your address is a private land parcel. There's no municipal reservoir there. I explained the quiet agreement, the off-the-books nature of the project. His tone went from confused to dismissive. Look, Mr. Blake, he said, his voice slick with bureaucratic detachment. It sounds like you're having a property dispute with your HOA. That's a civil matter. I'd advise you to contact your attorney. The county can't get involved in neighborhood disagreements. I tried one more time. This isn't a disagreement. This is a public safety risk. Thank you for your concern, he said, and the line went dead. So that was it. The system had forgotten itself. The new generation of managers only knew what was on their computer screens. My work, Frank's handshake, the promise made to protect thousands of people, it was all just ancient history. A ghost in the machine they no longer understood. I hung up the phone and realized I couldn't report the problem. I had to become the problem. I went into my workshop and cleared my workbench. This was no longer about getting my water back. It was about holding them all accountable. The HOA for its greed, and the county for its incompetence. I began to build my case, piece by piece. I printed the pictures of the dead fish and the exposed shoreline. I typed up a timeline of every conversation, every letter, every threat. I scanned the fraudulent contract, the bank statement showing the $120,000 payment, and the corporate records for Derek Krantz's shell company. I put all my original permits and deeds in a fireproof box. Sarah helped, digging up old news articles about the drought in the early 2000s, and finding the public meeting minutes where the board had vaguely discussed exploring backup water solutions without ever naming my lake. We were building a fortress of facts. But Madeline wasn't stupid. She knew she'd started a war, and she began to target my allies. A few days after we found the contract, a letter appeared on Sarah's door. It was an HOA violation notice. A picture, taken with a telephoto lens from the street, showed the corner of her back fence. The notice claimed it was 6 inches too high and made of non-approved materials. It was a beautiful cedar fence that had been there for 20 years. It was a clear message: help Tom, and you're next. Sarah was furious, but also scared. Other neighbors who had offered support went quiet. They stopped making eye contact when I got the mail. Madeline was isolating me, turning me into the neighborhood pariah she'd claimed I was on TV. The pressure was building. I looked out my window at the barren, cracked mud pit where my wife's memory used to be. The wild ducks were gone. The heron hadn't been back in days. My water was gone. The wildlife was dead. And now my friends were in the crosshairs because they dared to stand with me. In that moment, watching Sarah stare at the ridiculous violation notice in her hand, the grief finally burned away completely, leaving behind something cold and clear. They thought a few fines and a public shaming would make me fold. They thought the old man would eventually run out of energy and give up. They had no idea what I was capable of. I spent my entire career managing pressures you couldn't see. Water pressure, political pressure, the pressure of time in an emergency. They thought I'll fold, but I've done things with pressure they couldn't dream of. I made a phone call. The man who answered on the second ring had a voice like gravel in a coffee can. "Mac," I said, "I need a hand with some plumbing." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "Let me guess," Cal McAllister said. "This ain't about a leaky faucet." Mac was a retired fire captain, a man I'd worked with on a dozen emergency calls over the years. He understood infrastructure and pressure in a way few people do. He also had no love for bureaucrats. He showed up at my house after dark, his old pickup truck rumbling quietly to a stop in my driveway. He didn't park in front. Old habits. He was carrying a heavy canvas tool bag and 2 thermoses of what smelled like industrial-strength coffee. I led him out to the well cover in the backyard, shining a work light down into the concrete housing. Mac whistled low. "Well, I'll be," he said, peering down at the red valve. "That's the beast, huh? Never actually seen it. Just saw it on the old response maps." I nodded. "They forgot it was here." Mac grinned. A big, broad grin. "They poked the wrong damn bear, Tom. We worked through the night. It wasn't about destruction. It was about redirection. An engineer and a firefighter. 2 old guys with a century of practical knowledge between us. We didn't have to break anything. The system was designed with overrides, with bypasses and auxiliary lines meant for maintenance and emergencies. All you had to do was know which valves to turn and in what order. Following my old schematics, which I knew by heart, we located the main junction box a half-mile into the woods. We didn't shut off the main water supply. That would have been reckless. Instead, we isolated the secondary loop that fed the pressure assist pumps for 3 of the oldest housing developments in the county. It was a subtle change, not a catastrophic one. like tightening a string on a guitar just a little too much. It wouldn't break right away, but it would throw everything out of tune. By 4 a.m., we were done. We packed our tools, closed up the access panels, and left everything looking exactly as we had found it. As he was getting back in his truck, Mac clapped me on the shoulder. "Call me when the music starts," he said, and drove off into the pre-dawn quiet. The music started about 36 hours later. The first calls started trickling into the county water department on Tuesday afternoon. Low pressure. Then came Wednesday morning, when thousands of people were trying to shower, run dishwashers, and water their lawns. The already strained system, now deprived of its quiet pressure assist, began to falter. The trickle of calls became a flood. By Wednesday evening, the water pressure in 3 entire towns had dropped by 30%. Faucets sputtered. Toilets wouldn't refill properly. Then came the official alert. The drop in pressure created a risk of backflow contamination. A county-wide boil water advisory was issued. Suddenly, it wasn't just my problem anymore. It was everybody's problem. The local news, which had been so quick to dismiss my story as a neighborhood spat, was now leading with water crisis graphics. Panic buying cleared the bottled water out of every grocery store for miles. My phone rang just after the 10 o'clock news. It was Commissioner Peterson from the water department. His voice wasn't so slick and dismissive this time. It was tight, stressed. "Mr. Blake," he started, "we have a massive pressure drop in the eastern quadrant, and my engineers can't find a leak. It's not making any sense. Your name came up. The backup system you mentioned." I let the silence hang for a beat. "I told you it was a public safety risk," I said calmly. "You told me it was a civil matter." I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. "What do you know about this, Blake?" I didn't answer directly. Instead, I said, "Check your email." While he was on the phone, I'd sent him one file. It was a high-resolution scan of my original engineering map of the backup system. And on that map, I had drawn a thick red line, showing the exact boundaries of the protected watershed area. The line cut directly across the back of my property, encircling the lake. And it showed, with perfect legal clarity, exactly where Madeline Krantz had directed her nephew to trespass with heavy machinery. "This wasn't just about my lake, Commissioner," I said into the phone. "It was about your water, and you let them touch it." The fallout at the HOA was immediate. People who hadn't cared about my pond were now furious about their sputtering taps. They were connecting the dots. At an emergency HOA board meeting that night, Madeline tried to deflect. She called the water issue an unfortunate coincidence and blamed it on aging county infrastructure. But the other board members, facing a room full of angry homeowners, weren't buying it. They demanded to see the contract for the lake draining. Madeline refused, declaring the matter was now under classified legal action and shutting the meeting down. It was a classic bully move, but it was too late. The dam of her authority had cracked, but I had one last card to play. The part of the story that even Frank didn't know. The agreement I'd made with the county all those years ago wasn't a donation. It was a lease. A 20-year lease for the use of my private water and infrastructure for the grand sum of $1 a year. It was a formality, really, just to make it all legal and binding. And according to my records, that lease was set to expire next Tuesday. Unless it was renewed, with my signature, the county would officially lose all legal right of access to its own emergency water supply. They wouldn't just be dealing with low pressure. They would be trespassing. The community meeting was moved from the small HOA clubhouse to the high school auditorium to handle the crowd. Every seat was filled. The local news vans were parked out front, their satellite antennas raised. This wasn't just about my lake or Sarah's fence anymore. The boil water advisory had made it personal for everyone. People came carrying empty water jugs, waving overdue water bills, and holding signs that read, "We need water, not green space." The air was thick with anger and frustration. I waited in the hallway until the meeting was called to order. I wasn't alone. Sarah was right beside me, holding a crisp file folder. Frank, the old county director, stood with us, looking grimly determined. A half-dozen of my old colleagues from the county engineering department, all retired now, stood behind him. A quiet army of gray-haired competents. Mac was there too, standing near the back doors, just watching. When the doors opened, we walked in together. A ripple went through the crowd, as people recognized me from the initial news story. I didn't go to the podium. I just took a seat in the front row, Sarah and the others filing in around me, forming a silent, solid line. The HOA board sat at a long table on the stage, looking like they were facing a firing squad. Madeline was in the center, trying to project an aura of calm authority, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her pen. She opened the meeting by once again blaming the county for the water crisis. She called it a failure of public infrastructure and insisted the HOA's actions were unrelated. She was losing the crowd. People were yelling, shouting questions about the contract, about her nephew, the HOA vice president. A nervous-looking accountant named Bill kept trying to restore order, but it was like trying to herd cats in a thunderstorm. Finally, during a lull, a woman in the third row stood up. "I want to hear from Mr. Blake," she said, her voice clear and strong. "He's the one you accused of being a risk. I want to hear his side." Other voices joined in, a chorus of agreement. "Let him speak, let Tom speak." Madeline had no choice. She gestured reluctantly to the podium, her face a tight mask of annoyance. "The board recognizes Mr. Blake," she said, as if granting me a great favor. I walked up to the podium and adjusted the microphone. I looked out at the faces in the crowd, my neighbors. Some I'd known for decades, others were new. All of them looked worried. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke in the same calm, steady tone I'd used to explain a pressure differential to a new technician. "My name is Tom Blake," I began. "For 40 years, I was your county's senior water engineer. I'm the man who designed the system you're all relying on. And I'm the man whose private property was illegally entered and vandalized by your HOA president." I paused, letting that sink in. "She told you she drained my lake to protect you from a flood." That was a lie. I looked directly at Madeline. "The real reason is a bit more expensive." Sarah stood up and handed me a small tablet. I placed it on the podium and tapped the screen. A video started playing on the large projector screen behind the board. It was a shaky cell phone video, pulled from a public social media account. It showed Derek Krantz, Madeline's nephew, at a bar with some friends, bragging. He was slurring his words, holding up his phone. "Check it out," he was saying. "Signed and paid in full. 120 grand. Best part is, I get paid twice. Once to drain the old man's swamp, and again to fill it back in with pretty flowers. Easiest money I ever made." The crowd erupted. The video was time-stamped 2 days before the pumps even showed up at my house. Before Madeline could react, I turned off the video. "Let me be very clear," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. 1. The HOA has no legal jurisdiction over my lake or the watershed it sits in. None. 2. Draining that lake didn't just destroy a wildlife habitat. It crippled the emergency water supply for this entire region, a fact the county was repeatedly warned about. And 3. That so-called expert assessment she used to justify it was a fraudulent document created by her own nephew to secure a $120,000 contract, paid in full, without a board vote. That isn't mismanagement. That is criminal fraud. I let the weight of that word hang in the silent room. Then, I delivered the final blow. As of today, the county's 20-year lease agreement for emergency water access through my property is set to expire. I will not be renewing it. It was like a bomb went off. Commissioner Peterson, who was sitting in the back, went pale. The board members stared at me in disbelief. "What does that mean?" someone yelled. I turned to the crowd. "It means unless Madeline Krantz and any board member who supported her resigns immediately, and full restitution is made for the damages, the county's access to its only emergency water supply will be terminated permanently. The auditorium exploded. It was pure chaos. Madeline stood up, her face crimson, and tried to speak into her microphone, but her voice was drowned out by a tsunami of booing and shouts of, "Resign! Resign now!" The vice president, Bill, was frantically whispering with the board's attorney. He looked terrified. Then he did something I didn't expect. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, walked to the podium, and gently nudged me aside. "As of this moment," he announced, his voice trembling but clear, "I, William Chesterfield, tender my resignation from the HOA board, effective immediately." He'd come prepared. He knew this was coming. He laid the pre-written letter on the podium for everyone to see. One by one, 2 other board members did the same. The rats were leaving the sinking ship. Madeline was left standing on the stage alone, completely isolated. The crowd's anger was now focused solely on her. She looked wildly from the empty chairs beside her to the furious faces in front of her, and then, for the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. She turned and fled, practically running off the side of the stage and out a back exit. The crowd roared its approval. As she pushed open the exit door, she ran right into 2 sheriff's deputies who had been waiting quietly in the hall. One of them, a man I recognized from church, stepped forward and said calmly, "Madeline Krantz, you're being detained for questioning regarding environmental tampering and endangerment of public utilities." The door swung shut behind them, leaving the auditorium in stunned, triumphant silence. The next morning, my quiet street looked like a diplomatic summit. 2 black sedans with county government plates were parked in front of my house. Commissioner Peterson got out of one, looking like he hadn't slept. He was accompanied by a stern-looking woman who introduced herself as the county's chief counsel. They didn't come to threaten or demand. They came to negotiate. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Sarah and I had uncovered the fraud. They brought a draft of a new lease agreement, a thick document full of legalese. I pushed it aside without looking at it. "We're not talking about a lease yet," I said. "First, we're talking about the damage." Peterson started to stammer about budgets and procedures. The lawyer cut him off. "What are your terms, Mr. Blake?" she asked, her voice all business. I laid out 2 conditions, non-negotiable. First, the lake was to be fully restored to its original permitted specifications, not by the lowest bidder, but by a qualified engineering firm of my choosing. And it would be paid for entirely by the county, who would then recoup the costs from the HOA's insurance and Madeline herself. My second condition was bigger. The HOA, in its current form, is a threat to public safety, I said. Its charter needs to be dissolved. The residents can form a new community board, a proper one, under public oversight. No more secret meetings, no more unaudited contracts, no more petty tyrants with clipboards. The lawyer's eyebrows shot up. Dissolving an HOA charter was a messy, complicated process. "That's highly unusual," she said. "So is turning off a county's water supply," I replied. Peterson looked at his lawyer, then back at me. He saw the look in my eye. He knew I wasn't bluffing. He just nodded slowly. "We'll make it happen," he said. While the county lawyers started drawing up the new agreements, the consequences for Madeline's scheme were moving much faster. The district attorney, smelling a slam-dunk public corruption case, had already frozen the HOA's bank account and launched a full investigation into Derek Krantz's company, Eco Conversion Solutions. It turned out my lake wasn't his only grift. He had a string of them all over the state. The $120,000 contract was immediately canceled for fraud. Not only did Derek not get paid twice, he ended up with a massive bill from the county for the initial illegal pumping and a suspension of his contractor's license, pending criminal charges. The video of him bragging at the bar was now Exhibit A. He had, in his own drunken way, confessed to everything. With the new agreement signed and notarized, I called Mac, "It's time to turn the water back on," I said. That evening, we went back to the junction box in the woods. This time, there was no secrecy. A county engineering crew was there with us, along with Commissioner Peterson himself. He wanted to watch. He wanted to understand the system he'd ignored. With a nod from me, Mac and I took our positions. I gave the signal, and together, we slowly, methodically, turned the valves back to their original settings, reversing the sequence we had performed just days before. There was a low shudder in the pipes, a deep metallic groan, and then a steady, powerful hum as the pressure equalized and the system came back online. Peterson was watching a pressure gauge on his tablet. He looked up, his face a mixture of awe and relief. It's stabilizing," he said. "Pressure is back to 100%. The real restoration began a week later. A proper environmental engineering firm arrived, not with flimsy pumps, but with earth movers, hydrologists, and biologists. They carefully regraded the shoreline, aerated the soil, and began the slow process of refilling the lake from its natural spring source. The county even relocated the fish from a nearby hatchery to help repopulate the water. The work was precise, professional, and respectful. It was healing. A small public ceremony was held a month later at the water's edge. The boil water advisory was a bad memory, and the water in the lake was already halfway back to its normal level, clear and clean. Most of the neighborhood turned out. The local news was there again, but this time, the story was different. It wasn't about a dispute, it was about a community fixing itself. Sarah was asked to speak. She stood at a small podium, her voice steady and clear. She didn't talk about Madeline or the fraud. She talked about responsibility. "You don't fight pressure with panic," she said, looking out at the crowd. "You fight it with purpose. One person, one voice, one principled stand can remind a whole system of what it was built for in the first place, to serve the people, not the other way around." The crowd broke into applause. When I looked around, I saw my neighbors not just as people I lived next to, but as a community that had found its voice again. They weren't afraid anymore. They were organized, they were informed, and they were in charge. Madeline had tried to drain a lake, but in the end, she had flooded the truth out into the open for everyone to see. The fallout settled slowly over the next few months. Like dust after a demolition, Madeline's house went up for sale with a deep discount. She'd made bail, but the terms of her release, combined with the civil suits filed by the county and the newly formed community board, meant she was broke and facing serious jail time. No one saw her leave. One day the moving vans came, and the next they were gone. She vanished from the neighborhood, becoming a cautionary tale parents would tell their kids about what happens when you mistake power for intelligence. Her nephew Derek pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges. He got a hefty fine and a few years of probation, but his career as a shady contractor was over for good. The name Krantz became synonymous with a very specific, very public kind of failure. The county, true to its word, oversaw the complete dissolution of the old HOA charter. It was replaced by a 7-person volunteer community board, with Sarah Dillard unanimously elected as its first chairperson. Their meetings were held in the open, budgets were posted online, and the rulebook was rewritten from scratch. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to community upkeep and mutual support. The clipboard bullies were gone, replaced by neighbors talking to neighbors. One Saturday morning, Commissioner Peterson showed up at my door. He was alone this time, no lawyers, no entourage. He just wanted to walk the property. I took him out back, to the hidden well cover that housed the big red valve. He looked down at it for a long time. "We almost lost everything because we forgot this was here," he said, his voice quiet. "Because I forgot." He told me the County Water Authority had commissioned a new plaque. A few weeks later, they installed it on the side of the small, discreet valve house. It wasn't flashy, just a simple bronze square with raised lettering. It read, "In honor of Thomas Blake, who gave quietly and fought when it mattered. It wasn't a thank you for the infrastructure. It was a permanent reminder to the next generation of engineers and commissioners to never let institutional memory fail again, to never dismiss the old guy on the phone with a warning. Life in the neighborhood settled into a new kind of normal. Sarah and the new board started a watershed trust, a community fund dedicated to maintaining the health of the local streams and green spaces, including the area around my lake. People started taking ownership of their shared environment. A young veteran who had recently moved in down the street stopped me while I was getting the mail. He was a quiet guy, kept to himself mostly. He told me he'd been an army engineer. "I watched the whole thing unfold," he said, nodding toward the lake. "You could have gone in loud, all fire and brimstone, but you didn't. You just used the system's own weight against it. You showed us how to stand up without burning it all down. That's a lesson I won't forget." We shook hands, a simple gesture between two men who understood how things were built and how they could be broken. By late fall, the lake was full again. The water was still and clear, reflecting the brilliant orange and red of the autumn leaves. The engineering firm had done a beautiful job. They had even managed to save the flat river stones Eleanor had picked out, and they used them to rebuild the shoreline exactly as it had been. They'd brought back her bench too. I'd hired a local craftsman to etch her name into the backrest. Eleanor Blake, 1954 to 2018. The ducks had come back. A whole new family of them, paddling around the reeds. A familiar great blue heron had started visiting again, standing like a statue in the shallows, patient and watchful. Everything was as it should be. I took a cup of coffee out to the bench and sat down. The cool wood familiar beneath my hands. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the stones. The rage and the stress of the past few months felt a million miles away. It had all been so loud, so chaotic, but now there was just peace. The lake's quiet again, just how she liked it. But now, it knows how to roar.